Ladies and gentlemen, don't go away, because tonight is a heavy one, and you're going to learn some things you've never known before. But first, I must outline the basis for tonight's broadcast. Years ago, there was an organization called the Symbionese Liberation Army, whose leader, Mr. Sink, came out of the California prison system and was involved in a mind control experiment run by the United States government. It is our belief that it was this mind control experiment that created the Symbionese Liberation Army. And if you will remember, the last remaining members of that organization died in a fire set by the police, and they disappeared from history. In Philadelphia, another group, the MOVE group, died the same death, consumed in an overwhelming combustion, a flame. They died by fire. And they were not the only ones. This has an ancient history, for if you go back to the days of the Inquisition, anyone who was considered to be politically incorrect or did not go along with the status quo was again tied to a stake, faggots were laid around their feet, and they were consumed in a fire, in a flame. It is the history of a specific organization, a specific religious belief that causes these things to happen. Not long ago, in a town in Waco, Texas, a church known as the Branch Davidians were again consumed by the flame, burned in the fire. In this hidden religion, they believe that all things in nature are renewed by fire. Their enemies are cleansed and cannot come back to get them. It is known to us as the Waco Massacre. Today, on all the news media, you were told that in Switzerland, a religious cult led by a man who called himself the Messiah, or Jesus, committed mass suicide. And it was a lie. You're going to learn the truth now, and then during the rest of this hour, I'm going to reveal to you this mystery religion. I'm going to tell you who these people are, who do these things, who eliminate their enemies and burn them, consume them in the flame, the fire. Remember, in Dallas, Texas, in Dealey Plaza, there is an obelisk representing the generative force of this religion. On the top of this obelisk is a flame. A flame. On the grave of John F. Kennedy burns an eternal flame put there in mockery by those who murdered him in a temple of the sun. On Elm Street, he was the sacrificed king. And in Cherry, Switzerland, police, late last night, which was day there, found 48 bodies after fires in 2 Swiss villages linked to a Canadian-based religion led by a charismatic doctor who was said to have portrayed himself as a new Christ. Does this sound familiar? 22 of the bodies, many clad in black and red cloaks, which is the color of the mystery school, Freemasonry, black and red cloaks and with bullet wounds to the head, were found in a hidden basement under a barn in Cherry, a farming community in western Switzerland. They did not commit suicide. Another body, that of a 73-year-old Geneva man who had rented the buildings 4 years ago, lay in a nearby farmhouse with a plastic bag over his head. He had also been shot execution style. In the alpine mountainside hamlet of Granges-sur-Salvan, 100 miles to the south, firemen pulled 25 corpses from the smoldering ruins of 2 chalets, and a police spokesman said it was feared more bodies were in another house still burning. A local official and fireman who was among the first to find the cheery bodies said some were in a secret chapel, apparently set up by members of this religion, whom they say called themselves, and I quote, the Order of the Solar Temple, end quote, headed by the homeopathic Dr. Luc Jaurès, 46, of Canada. Police said Jaurès was also the owner of 2 of the chalets at Granges. In Canada, police in Quebec told our representatives that a house he owned there had also burned late on Tuesday, and 2 people had been consumed by those flames. There was no indication whether Jaurès reported to have fled from Canada to Switzerland after he and other members of his group were prosecuted for weapons offenses was among the dead in the 3 incidences. Pillar told the news conference in Sherry the bodies there were lying on their stomachs or on their backs in a resting position with plastic bags over their heads. There were no signs of struggle. Notice, they call this organization a cult. They say that the cult was led by a charismatic doctor who was said to have portrayed himself as a new Christ, Jesus. Many of the bodies were clad in black and red cloaks. They had bullet wounds to the head. They were executed. They did not commit suicide. They were all in several locations throughout Switzerland and Canada, and they were all burned, consumed in the flame. Many ages have elapsed since the Egyptian priest-king passed through the pillars of Thebes, ages before what they call the sinking of Atlantis, thousands of years before the Christian era. Egypt was a land, they say, of great truths. It was certainly the land of the mysteries. The hand of the great white brotherhood was held out to the empire of the Nile, and the passages of the ancient pyramid resounded with the chants of the initiates. Yes, for they were never built as tombs, but temples of initiation, and it was then that the Pharaoh, now called half human and half divine, reigned in ancient Egypt. Pharaoh is the Egyptian word for king. Many of the later pharaohs were degenerate and of little account. It is only early pharaohs we now list among the priest kings. Try to picture for a moment the great hall of Luxor, or, if you will, the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. The great hall of Luxor, its inscriptive columns holding up domes of solid granite, each column carved with the histories of the gods. There, at the upper end of the chamber, sat the Pharaoh of the Nile in his robes of state, around him his counselors, chief among them the priest of the temple. An imposing spectacle it was. The gigantic frame of the later Atlantean, robed in gold and priceless jewels, on his head the crown of the north and south, the double empire of the ancients, on his forehead the coiled serpent of the initiate. The serpent which was raised in the wilderness, that all who looked upon it might live. This Urias represented the sleeping serpent power in man, which coiled head downward around the tree of life, drove him from the garden of the Lord, but which raised upon the cross became the symbol of the Christ in the mysteries. The Pharaoh was an initiate of Scorpio. Scorpio. Another word for Scorpio in the mysteries is Lucifer, and the serpent is the transmuted Scorpio energy, which, working upward in the regenerated individual, is called the Kundalini. The Kundalini. The serpent was the sign of initiation. It meant that within him the serpent had been raised. For the true Pharaoh was a priest of God. Which God you will discover as we go. As well as a master of men, he sat upon the cube altar throne, indicating his mastery over the four elements of his physical body, a judge of the living and of the dead. In spite of all his power and glory and the grandeur of the world's greatest empire, still he bowed in humble supplication to the will of the gods, plural. In his hand he carried the triple scepter of the Nile, the flail or whip, the shepherd's crook, and the Anubis-headed staff. These were the symbols of his work. They represented the powers which he had mastered. With the whip, he had subjugated his physical body. With the shepherd's crook, he was the guardian and keeper of his emotional body. With the Anubis-headed staff, he was master of his mind and worthy to wield the powers of government over others, because first of all, he obeyed the laws himself. With all his robes of state, with the scarab upon his breast, and with the all-seeing eye above his throne, there was still nothing as precious or as sacred to the ancient Egyptian priest-king as the triangular girdle or apron, which was the symbol of his initiation, the apron which is still worn in the lodges of the Sons of Light, the Freemasons, the Freemasons. The apron of the ancient Egyptian carried with it the same symbolism as the Masonic apron of today. It symbolized the purification of the body. When the seat of the lower emotions, Scorpio, was covered by the white sheepskin of purification, this symbol of his purification was the most precious belonging of the ancient Pharaoh. And this plain insignia, worn by many others below him in rank and dignity, but equal to him in spiritual purification, was the most precious of all things to the priest-king. There he sat enthroned, adorned with the symbols of his purification and mastery, a wise king over a wise people, and it was through these priest-kings that the divine worked, for they were the order of Melchizedek. Through them was formulated that doctrine which degeneracy has not been able entirely to obliterate, which we know as the divine right of kings. Divine because through spirituality and growth, God was able to manifest through them. They were conscious instruments in the hands of a ready ruler, willing and proud to do the work of those with whom through knowledge and truth they had attuned themselves. They were the purveyors and the keepers of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. They were the Gnostics, the knowers of good and evil. But the time came, as in all nations, when selfishness and egotism entered the heart of king and people alike, and slowly the hand of the great white brotherhood that it had fed ancient Egypt was withdrawn, and the powers of darkness transformed the land of glory into one of ruins, and the names of mighty kings were buried beneath the oblivion. Mighty cataclysms shook the world, and out of the land of darkness the great white brotherhood led the faithful few into the promised land. Egypt, the land of glory, disintegrated into dust. The great temples of the pharaohs are ruins, and the temples of Isis are but broken heaps of sandstone. But what of the priest kings who labored there in the days of its glory? Well, ladies and gentlemen, they are still with us. For those who were leaders before are leaders now, if they have continued to walk the path. Although his scepter be gone and his priestly vestments molded away, the priest-king still walks the earth with the dignity and the power and the childlike simplicity that made him great before. He no longer wears the robes of his order. He wears a suit and a tie. Yet although he bears no credentials, he bears the secret signs and handshakes and whispered passwords. And he is as much a priest-king now as then, for he still bears the true insignia of his rank. The coiled serpent has given place to knowledge and lies and deception. The coiled serpent has given the world both good and evil. The hand that bestowed the riches of the past, although he no longer carries the scepters of self-mastery, still he manifests that mastery in his daily life, or so he manages to fool himself that he does. And although the altar fires within the temple of Karnak have long been dead, the true fire still burns, and before it he still bows as he bowed in the days of Egypt's glory. And while the Branch Davidians, the children, the men and women, were being consumed by the flames, agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were seen to raise their arms into the air and bow to the fire. Although the priest is no longer his counselor and the wise ones of his country no longer aid him in problems of state, still he is never alone, for the priests in white and the counselors in blue still march with him and whisper words of strength when he needs them. And there are always the hollow, sacred, secretive, secure halls of the lodge. And still in the invisible ether about the pyramids of Giza, the initiations continue. Still, the initiate receives the insignia of his rank, the coiled serpent. Before that fire, he makes his vows, and upon the burning altar of his own higher being, he lays his crown and his scepter, his robes and his jewels, his hates and his fears, and sanctifies his life as a priest-king, and swears to serve none but his own higher self, the God within.